On July 29, 1966, Bob Dylan crashed a motorcycle on a road outside Woodstock, New York. No police report was filed. No hospital record exists. The full extent of his injuries was never officially confirmed. And Bob Dylan, the man who had been the voice of a generation, who had released 3 landmark albums in 14 months, who had been booed at Newport and called Judas in Manchester, and was, at the moment of the crash, the most talked about musician in the world, disappeared for 8 years. He didn't tour again until 1974, while the world speculated, was he dead, disfigured, insane? He was in Woodstock, in a house with his family, recording more than 100 songs in a basement with the musicians who would become the band. In 2004, Dylan wrote in his memoir, "I had been in a motorcycle accident and I'd been hurt, but I recovered. Truth was that I wanted to get out of the rat race." This is the story of the crash, and what may have really happened. By July 1966, Bob Dylan had been on the road almost continuously for 5 years. He had a 64-date American tour scheduled to begin in August. He had a contract with ABC Television for a documentary. He had a manuscript, a prose poetry collection called Tarantula, due to his publisher. He had a wife. He had a young son. He had bought an 11-room house called High Low Ha on Camelot Road outside Woodstock. He told a journalist in 1969, "I was on the road for almost 5 years. It wore me down. I was on drugs, a lot of things just to keep going, you know, and I don't know how I did it." The amphetamines that had fueled the 1966 world tour were not sustainable. Various accounts from people who saw Dylan in the weeks before the crash describe someone who was exhausted to the point of breakdown, who could not sleep without chemical assistance and could not perform without it either. His manager, Albert Grossman, had built an empire around Dylan's output. Grossman needed Dylan on stage, on record in the public eye. Grossman was not the kind of manager who paused. Dylan, in retrospect, needed the crash, whether it happened the way the legend says or not. Dylan said he had been on drugs, a lot of things, just to keep going. At what point does the music industry stop being support and start being extraction? On the morning of July 29, 1966, Bob Dylan set out on his 1964 Triumph Tiger T100 motorcycle from his manager Albert Grossman's house in Bearsville, near Woodstock. His wife Sarah was following in their station wagon. He turned onto Glasco Turnpike. The sun was in his eyes. Dylan later recalled, "I was blinded by the sun for a second. I just happened to look up right smack into the sun with both eyes, and sure enough, I went blind for a second, and I panicked. I stomped down on the brake and the rear wheel locked up on me and I went flying." Sarah brought him back to Grossman's house. Grossman's wife Sally was there. She saw Dylan kind of moaning and groaning, but noticed no obvious signs of injury. Dylan did not go to a hospital. He went to the house of a doctor named Ed Thaler in Middletown, New York, a friend rather than a formal physician. Thaler's widow said in a 2016 interview, "He didn't want to go to the hospital, so we said, 'You can stay here.'" Dylan spent approximately 6 weeks at Thaler's house before returning to Woodstock. Over the years, he has described different injuries: broken vertebrae, a concussion, facial lacerations. No medical record confirms any specific injury, whether the crash was as serious as the rumors suggested, or whether it was, as some biographers have argued, a convenient way out of obligations he no longer wanted, is a question that has never been definitively answered. Dylan himself said in 2004, "I woke up and caught my senses. I realized that I was just working for all these leeches, and I didn't want to do that." Dylan later said the crash helped him realize he was working for leeches. Do you think the accident happened the way he described, or was part of it chosen? While the world wondered what had happened to Bob Dylan, he was in Woodstock. He was with Sarah, he was with his children, he was in the house on Camelot Road with the 11 rooms and the trees. And then he started recording. The musicians who had been his backing band, who would call themselves the band within a few years, had rented a house nearby called Big Pink, a pink house in the Catskill Mountains. Dylan would go over to Big Pink, or the band would come to his house, or they would record in the basement of Big Pink, where the acoustics were strange and the sound was intimate, and nothing was being made for release. In 1967, the year of Sgt. Pepper, the year the world was looking for its musical leaders, Bob Dylan was in a basement in the Catskills, recording old folk songs, country songs, original songs that sounded like nothing he had ever released, and basement tapes originals that were unlike anything anyone was making anywhere. They recorded more than 100 songs, loosely, casually, without the pressure of a session or a deadline. Nothing was too far out, Robbie Robertson later said. We were just amusing ourselves. The recordings were not released, not officially, not at the time. Rough mixes were distributed to publishers so other artists could record the songs. The recordings spread as bootlegs. The basement tapes were officially released in 1975, 8 years after they were made. They are now considered among the most important recordings in American music history. Dylan was making music in a basement in 1967 that the world wouldn't hear until 1975. While the world watched Sgt. Pepper change music in 1967, Bob Dylan was in a Woodstock basement recording songs nobody would hear for 8 years. What does that say about where the real music gets made? When Bob Dylan did return, publicly on record in interviews, he was different, not just older, different. His first post-crash album, John Wesley Harding, was released in December 1967. It was sparse, quiet, biblical, the opposite of the swirling electric ambition of Blonde on Blonde. Nobody had expected it. Nobody had quite expected anything from Dylan by this point, not because they had stopped waiting, but because the waiting had gone on long enough that the anticipation had curdled into something else. Nashville's skyline came next. Country music, almost unrecognizably gentle. Dylan's voice had changed completely. The rasp was gone. A warm, surprisingly tender tenor had replaced it. Some biographers have attributed the vocal change to giving up smoking. Others have suggested it was a more conscious reinvention, the same instinct for self-transformation that had turned Robert Zimmerman into Bob Dylan, now turning the blonde on blonde Bob Dylan into something quieter. He didn't tour until January 1974. That tour with the band sold more than 5 million ticket requests for 140,000 seats. 5 million people had been waiting 8 years for a chance to see Bob Dylan live. He had been in Woodstock. He had been with his family. He had been recording in basements. The man who came back was not the same man who had crashed on Glasco Turnpike on July 29, 1966, which was, more than likely, exactly the point. Subscribe. The final volume of the Bob Dylan Files is next, and it ends where nobody expected.